My name is Dennis Groth, and I'm the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education here at Indiana University Bloomington. And I am just absolutely thrilled to be here today, but even more thrilled that all of you are here today. This is an important step for us, an important recognition, first of our fellows, and I'm going to introduce our fellows to everybody, but also important for the campus from a variety of different standpoints. This is Indiana University's active learning initiative. The first thing I'd like to point out is that active learning at Indiana University is not new. So this is, although chock full of newness in terms of our approach, this is a continuation of strength and a building upon the strength that all of you, all of our faculty colleagues have built in to the teaching and learning experience here in Bloomington. I was asked to speak about a couple of things. One was the importance of the Mosaic Initiative relative to the Bicentennial Strategic Plan. And rather than just state something pretty simply like, this is important because it's part of the strategic plan, which seems kind of a circular argument, it's more interesting to think about why are the elements of the strategic plan articulated in the way that they are. It's in the strategic plan, active learning and active learning spaces, because it is a core value, and then our principles are derived from our core value, learning, and the benefits and values associated with active learning as opposed to passive learning. We're way beyond the time when students can just binge like Netflix, passively watching episode after episode of The Flash, like I did just last night. And although that has a certain form of enjoyment and entertainment, it's not why the university exists. The university exists to push the envelope continuously. And through its built environment and its built environment of learning spaces and the engagement of faculty through their innovative approaches to utilize these spaces is why it was so important that we could construct the strategic plan to have the elements that it has. So we're not doing this because the strategic plan says we're going to do it. That's a way of accounting. It's in the strategic plan because it is part of our DNA, and part especially of the DNA of all of the individuals in this room, beyond the wonderful lunch that's been set, but really because of our interest in extending teaching and learning and being creative. So I'm going to leave to others, and in particular my colleague and partner in this endeavor, Stacy Maroney, to talk about the details of our approach behind the Mosaic Initiative. I do want to introduce the inaugural class of Mosaic Fellows. And as I do, I'd like to ask our fellows to stand, and we'll give a round of applause at the end. And I'm going to start with Tessa Bent. She's an associate professor in speech and hearing sciences. Virginia. This is being recorded. Let's take another take on this. Virginia Ojas Carbonell, a lecturer in Spanish and Portuguese. Kalani Craig, clinical assistant professor of history. Jay Duncan, lecturer in informatics and computing. Julie Knapp, clinical assistant professor in recreation, park, and tourism studies. Erica Lee. Wait, you were supposed to stay standing, everybody. Active learning. Lecturer in informatics and computing. Eileen Monahan, professor of practice in journalism. Dan Rickert, lecturer in informatics and computing. So that's 3 from informatics and computing. I'm a faculty member in informatics and computing, but I had nothing to do with the selection of the fellows. The fellows are selected through a completely separate process from me. As Stacy knows, my role is support and transfer money from one account to the other account. Make sure that I just get out of the way. Jill Robinson, senior lecturer in chemistry. Susan Sienna, a lecturer in public and environmental affairs. And Arvind Verma, associate professor of criminal justice. Let's congratulate our fellows. So it's just an outstanding group. They are going to demonstrate over the course of the project how to utilize and how we can be informed about generating new spaces. What works, what does not work. You'll see the ideas behind the Mosaic Initiative are not about how do we make one thing available in multiple different ways around the campus. This is how do we take many approaches, and how do we move the built environment closer to learning and trying to find out what works best. And if we're successful with this, and I believe we will be successful, then our students will learn more, we'll have higher levels of success. Teaching will become even a greater, awareness of our great teaching will become even more broadly known around the region and the country and across the campus in particular. And so I am just so excited to see how this moves along. And that will now conclude my part of the comments, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Stacy Maroney. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Dennis. So I wanted to do a little bit of, maybe take a trip down memory lane just for a moment. I promise to be brief because I know you're waiting for Adam's talk. But so to set the context for how we got to the Mosaic Initiative. And so Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, former Vice Provost, Sonia Stevens, and now Dennis and I have been at this for a while, together with our partners in the University Architect's Office. Michelle Buckland is in the room from UAO Interiors. This was a tremendous partnership where we all got together and we said, what can we do to change the nature of the classrooms across Indiana University? And so we did that, and we had some good success. And we paraded Adam around a few of these spaces on our IUPUI campus and of course here in Bloomington. So, but at the same time, we knew that simply creating these wonderful new classrooms was not going to be enough. We had to do more. Because many of these classrooms require faculty to think very differently about their teaching. So it wasn't enough to create the classrooms. We had to say, okay, what else do we need to do to make this successful? And so what we did is we said we need a comprehensive set of services for faculty. So support the faculty who teach in these rooms. Help them think differently about their pedagogy. Help them study what they're doing in these spaces. And then let that inform what we do going forward. So we are thrilled that this is launching first in Bloomington. It will move to the other campuses of Indiana University very soon hereafter, starting with IUPUI and then moving to the regional campuses after that. So one quick thing you may, and Dennis just hinted at this, you may wonder, why did you call this Mosaic? Well, so what a lot of universities have done around active learning is they came up with one design for a classroom, and they said, an active learning classroom looks like this. And so we consulted with some colleagues at the University of Iowa who have a program called TILE. And this program is one in which they do, in fact, have all the same kinds of classrooms. And so when we were consulting with them, I said, you know, it's not that we have a tile, it's more like we have a mosaic of different kinds of classrooms. And so that name kind of stuck. And I remember that because it was Halloween a year and several months ago when we first named the initiative. And then Dennis and I got together and we said, we need to do something and we need to create this initiative. And here we are. And so it's a thrilling day for us to really be launching this initiative. So what I want to do now is introduce our keynote speaker. And I should tell you, so I was thinking about this day and what should we do on this day. We knew we wanted to have a luncheon, invite interested faculty, staff, and students to attend. And it was like, we need a keynote speaker. And I'm walking along, and I stop. And I say, I need Adam. And so I quickly ran to my computer and hoped that he would accept our invitation, and he did. So let me just say a little bit about him, and then I'll turn it over to him. I think he's going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions. So he is a leading authority. He is from McGill University in Montreal. He says the weather's about the same there as it is this morning here in Indiana. He's a leading authority on active learning spaces and the pedagogical practices that support active learning. At McGill, he's responsible for leading university-wide initiatives to improve teaching and learning. Over the past few years, he has been focused on designing innovative physical and virtual learning spaces that support active learning. His research interests include the interrelationship of teaching and learning in physical, that means classroom teaching and simulation labs, and virtual online environments. He's a sought-after speaker, and we are very fortunate to have him today. He will talk about new approaches to active learning and the research behind teaching and learning in classrooms like Mosaic classrooms. Please welcome Adam Finkelstein.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation. I want to thank Stacy, thank Dennis. We've got to thank Tracy over here for a lot of the tours, and Julie, who's wandered me through your wonderful campuses. And I have to say, some really impressive, fantastic spaces. And I think what's really interesting is that the approaches that you're taking are very similar to the approaches that we've been taking, in that thinking that space is not a cookie cutter kind of concept, and that what we really do want on our campus is a mosaic of different types of spaces to support different types of learning. So just to give you a couple of housekeeping notes, I'd never stay in one place, ever. So I'm going to be bouncing around. I'm probably not going to stand up here. I'm probably going to stand here, and I might hover over you at one point or another. Don't be frightened. I'm not going to, out you and point to you. Actually, I might. I warn you, I might do that. But I think what I really want to focus on is the first sentence, which really kicks off it's a great quote from Chickering and Gamison that talks about learning is not a spectator sport. And we need to think about getting our students active and why space is such an important part of that process. There is a hashtag if you want to tweet something. And as mentioned, I'm from Teaching and Learning Services at McGill, which is basically the teaching and learning center at our university. We're very, very similar to you. We have about 35,000 undergraduates, strong graduate programs, tier 1 research institution. It actually doesn't really it looks like this right now. But we know snow, we know winter. So there's a lot of similarities. We have a lot of different types of buildings. We have an enormous deferred maintenance project problems, as people in the audience that are involved in facilities and planning are probably concerned about, that we have hidden things behind the walls and all that sort of stuff that goes along with it. One of the things that I do at McGill is, as part of Teaching and Learning Services, help organize and run the two committees that basically decides everything having to do with teaching labs and classrooms at the university. So these two committees make up about 45 people each, representing people from all over the university. And we recommend, adjudicate, decide on multi-million dollars worth of funding. We then commission the designs. I sit on all the design teams to design all of our spaces with our design teams, with faculty and architects, et cetera. And then we kick them off, build them, and then do the support. So one of the nice things about having that being driven from a teaching and learning perspective is that A, we keep it focused on what the teaching and learning needs are for the spaces we're building. And second, what's really nice is that we see it start to finish. We both commission all of the spaces, design the spaces, and then design the support around those spaces. So we get to see them being used. So before I want to get to that, I know that it's a very diverse audience. So I just wanted to get a quick show of hands. How many of you are faculty or teaching faculty? Okay. How many of you are architects? Where are my architects? All right, well, you still count as an architect. We at least have one. All right. How many of you are the AV folks or AV designer folks? Okay, all right, a few of those. Learning space design that's not AV, okay. IT folks that are related to support. Okay, oh, a lot of you, okay. And then administrators, we'll throw you in there too. You're probably faculty teaching as well. Students. I hear there are students here, okay, graduate students and undergraduate students. Any undergraduate students? Okay, a few undergraduate students, great. So nothing like having an audience that's, really similar that you can talk to the same things about. But that's great because I think that sort of representative here is a really good example of the representative types of issues that we have when we design spaces. We're not designing things for one person. We're designing for multiple types of people. Now, the irony of talking about active learning in a keynote is not lost upon me. So, one of the things that I have to do is we have to do something active, at least at the very beginning. So what I do want to do is I want to take no more than 2 minutes, and I want you to think about this in your head. What are your burning questions right now about active learning or active learning spaces or designing active learning spaces, teaching them, whatever those burning questions are? On your table, you have sticky notes. So what I'd like you to do is take a minute, think for 2 minutes, write down that burning question that you have, okay, and then I'll tell you what we're going to do next. So you have 2 minutes, and the start is now. Now you're supposed to think before you talk, so just think about it for a second. You only get to write down one. You have 1 minute left. Okay, now once you have that burning question, okay, I'd like you to do one thing with it, well, actually 2 things with it. The first thing I'd like to do is I'd just like to get maybe 2 or 3 volunteers to actually say what their burning question is. We have microphones. This is practice and feedback. This is practice for the Q&A session at the end. So this is our opportunity to work out the kinks. So if you have a question and you'd like to throw your burning question to the crowd, can you raise your hand and we'll run a microphone to you. All right, so we have one here. Microphones are running and coming.
There's a running microphone.
Here we go, running microphone. Go for it.
How do we get the vast majority of tenured faculty to adopt active learning as the core teaching mode in all undergraduate courses?
All right, great, awesome, easy question, no problem. We'll talk about that. Start me off with something super simple. All right, good. Another question maybe from this side of the room. Oh, right there is fine, and then we'll go to this side of the room.
So I've been involved in putting a makerspace in our School of Education. So my question is, what aspects of a makerspace can or should be incorporated in other classrooms?
Okay, excellent question. One last one from this side somewhere. Somebody raise their hand, or we'll point to you. Oh, right there in the back there.
How do we accommodate diverse learners in an active learning space?
Okay, perfect. Okay, so sort of a UDL approach or something along those lines, talking about diverse learners. Okay, so that's great. And now I know there are about 140-ish burning questions that are sitting on the table, so keep track of them. What we're going to do is we're actually hand them all to Tracy, who's actually going to answer them later on in the next month. Okay, so just make sure we keep those burning questions, and you can feel free to add them as you go through the next little while in the talk. So what I want to do is talk about, there are 2 basic goals that we're going to talk about this morning during lunch. One is look a little bit at the theoretical foundation for active learning and sort of what's the evidence and what does the research say? I mean, we really want to make sure that we're practicing or doing evidence-based practice. And so what's out there? The second thing we need to talk about is exploring why space matters and why space is important. Now, a lot of you know that, and what I'm going to do is probably give you a little bit of terminology and theory to things that you already know, which is actually what we do in education. We basically just take practical things you always knew and give you words for them and things like that. So that's what we spend most of our time researching, stuff your grandmother already knew. So that said, one of the things that's very clear is that higher ed's been under siege. It's been under siege from the general public. And when you look at a lot of the data coming out of, let's say, the Pew Internet Research Studies and the research centers, people don't think college is affordable. And in fact, it might not be for a vast majority. Now, we're public institutions. You're a public institution. We're also a public institution. All Canadian universities are public institutions. But it's not the case all around, and it's not the case for a lot of students. So university or in college is really not that affordable, or at least it's thought not to be affordable by the general public. The second thing is it's also not thought to be of good value. That hurts. That really hurts when you think about that's basically what we're dedicating our life to. But what's interesting is that this is what the general public is saying, and this is what the general public is perceiving. That being said, what's really interesting is that we have never had a more educated young population ever. So students are coming. So people are still going to university. And not only are they going to university, but university is still a great way to get yourself ahead in life. It still gives you better job prospects out the other end. So there is this real discordance between what the public is thinking about and what people who are actually attending university are talking about. Here we're looking at the millennial generations and if you look at women, you can really see the difference of what's happened from, the silent generation all the way to now, a massive increase in the number of people that are attending university. But we all know that students have mixed experiences when they come. And this wonderful book called Academically Adrift from Richard Aram and Roxa, you have to read it and have a glass of wine next to it, because when you read it, it can really get you depressed if you're not careful. So you have to be very, very careful when you read this book. But there are some really interesting things in it. One thing I want to point out at the very beginning here is this first quote, which talks about the typical student meets with the faculty only once per month, and 10% of our students never meet a faculty member. That's disturbing. Of course, it never happens at our institutions. This is just other institutions that are really in trouble. We're doing okay, all right? But that was a joke. So, these are some things that we have to think about, that, a lot of times students are not being as challenged as they could be. Maybe they're not doing as much work as they could be. There is this concern that we are drifting. And we have to be very, very much aware of that students are having mixed experiences. One of the interesting things that this book talks about is that we have to start refocusing on learning, on what's happening in classrooms, what's happening in labs, what's happening in seminars, and this is a core thing that is absolutely critical in order for us to move forward, which you'd think would be obvious. I mean, we're institutions of learning, except we're not just about learning, and that's one of the things that makes it very difficult. One of the interesting things about universities is that we deal with not just the intellectual growth of students. We deal with social growth of students, emotional growth of students. We're dealing with the physical growth of students. We're providing a safe environment for students to become adults. And that is a very, very difficult thing to do, and often misunderstood by everybody else around and outside of universities. So just to back up for a second, so if we know that we have to focus on learning, what does the research tell us about what we know about learning? What do we know about teaching and learning? So one of the best ways to start is, okay, I learn best when, complete this sentence for me. I learn best when, come on. Read. Okay, all right, wait, hold on, I gotta get a little, everybody's talking at the same time. So somebody over here. I learn best when?
Answer your question now, when I have time to reflect.
When you have time to reflect. Sorry? When you're on your feet? Okay, when you're on your feet.
I'm motivated.
When you're motivated. When you have a guide, a study guide. When it's fun.
In a quiet space.
In a quiet space. Somebody over here. When you work with other people. So nothing to say that we have the same answer across the board. So you can immediately see that idea that we have a real diverse experience of learning and a diverse interest in learning. And it's interesting also that not one of you, and I'd even hear it in the big run, ever said, I learn best when I'm lectured at. Which is really interesting because I'm lecturing at the moment. But we'll talk about that in a second, the sort of the dissonance there. So what do we know about teaching and learning? Well, we do know about how people learn. And people learn by constructing a model or constructing information and ideas within their own head, which means that everybody that you're looking at is constructing their ideas within their own brain differently. Okay? It doesn't mean that we learn differently necessarily, and it doesn't mean that there's anything like learning styles or any of that other hokey garbage that we're talking about either. You know, in fact, learning styles exist, but they have no implication in terms of teaching and learning that you have to worry about at all in terms of the literature. But we do create and construct our brain, create and construct in our brain a representation of what's all going on in the world. And we know that learners learn best when they're able to connect new knowledge to old knowledge. So we're constantly building on what our experiences have had and what we bring into the classroom, which means that with all of your students, their backgrounds are critical to how they're going to engage with you in the class. The second thing is about the wonderful myth of the multitasker. Does everybody know about multitasking? Okay, it doesn't exist. Let's repeat that. It does not exist. There is no evidence that multitasking exists with human beings, period. There is no brain-based evidence for it whatsoever. If students tell you, I'm multitasking, you say, no, you're not. You're not at all. You're just not paying attention. So this is one of the core problems that we have to think about. You cannot learn if you cannot focus your attention. You have to focus on the task at hand. This is why if you're watching a great television program, you're reading a great book, and somebody comes up behind you, probably your partner, and whacks you on the head and said, I've been calling you for 15 minutes to come to dinner. You have not been listening to me. And it's like, what? Huh? What are you talking about? That's because we're engaged. We're engaged with what we're doing and we're focusing our attention. We cannot focus on 3 things at once. We can switch tasks. We can switch tasks quickly, so we can move from this to this to this. But if your email is popping up at you where you're trying to write something very pithy, you're not going to get through that activity. And we have to think about that when it comes to learning, because if we're designing learning in our classrooms, we have to think about focus. And maybe it's time we close the laptop, or maybe it's time you open the laptop. We have to think about all of that moving forward. Third, we have to stay motivated. Motivation is the precursor to everything. It could be external motivation, where you've got a grade hanging over the head. But ideally, we want to get it towards internal motivation. We want students focused on what they want to learn and get them interested in the particular topic, which means engagement is absolutely critical. Fourth, we know that you have to receive feedback very, very close to the event of learning in order for anything to happen, which means the problem of the lecture-lab split in STEM is a huge one. Why? Because you have the class and the lecture, and then 3 days later, you then apply it in lab. What's the problem? You've forgotten everything that happened 3 days ago. So we really need to rethink, okay, how can we have a chance to talk about, or let's say do a lecture on a topic or learn about a topic, and then immediately apply it? And then not only apply it, but then get feedback by somebody who's farther along in that process. That could be a peer, it could be a TA, it could be an instructor. We need that feedback to happen very, very quickly. Because what happens is we have the one midterm, and that's when all the students come crying in your office because it's like, oh my God, I didn't understand. It's like, because that's the only time they've gotten that feedback. We need rapid feedback, and we need it earlier. And of course, we need to work on engaging collaborative experiences. We need to work together, and we need to make sure that students are able to work together. So, what is active learning? So, I mean, active learning could be, learning on jumping jacks. It could be running around. It could be standing up. Yes, that's active in one way. But one of the nicest definitions that I want to point to in terms of active learning is that the mind is actively engaged. Okay, we need to think of ways of getting students' brains actively engaged. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a second. The second thing is that students are dynamic participants in the process. Learning is not done to them, it's done with them, which means that we have to really, really think about student responsibility in this process. Students have a responsibility. They have to come ready to go, ready to get engaged. And that's something that we don't always think about and something we have to think about moving forward. Some of the characteristics of active learning, it's involved more than listening. You could be listening and taking notes. Okay, that's more active. But just listening isn't enough. Students are usually engaged in activities that are highly cognitive, reflecting, discussing, writing. This came out in our discussions with you here. There's usually an emphasis on higher order thinking, application analysis, evaluation. That's kind of high level in terms of thinking with active learning. I mean, if I wanted to say, okay, we're going to have a discussion of when the War of 1812 happened, go. The War of 1812 happened in 1812. And actually, I just want to point out that you guys didn't necessarily win that war, but we'll come back to that later. We'll come back to that later. But the next one here is that, of course, the instructor's role changes from being sort of that disseminator of knowledge, which, of course, you guys know, you're here, you're talking about Mosaic, to that facilitator feedback. And it's usually, but doesn't always involve collaboration. You can be active alone. You can do active learning alone. This is an important piece as well. Active learning does not mean you have to talk all the time. You need time for reflection. You need time to think. You need time to gel ideas within your head. You need time to write. You need time to draw. Those are important pieces of the process. So where's the evidence? What is the evidence out there that active learning is really a good idea, that this is something that we should be doing? Well, here's one actually from your university. So Richard Hacke is from the Department of Physics. Now, I don't know if he's still here, but I only realized actually maybe 2 weeks ago that he's actually at Indiana University. His name is Hake. Okay, there you go, perfect. So somebody can even describe it better than I can. But what I want to point out here is looking at 6,000 students in terms of test data, looking at introductory physics, and found that students in courses with interactive engagement gained almost 2 standard deviations over those doing traditional methods. Here's another way of looking at it, that the courses that were doing much more active learning had a significant gain. They had the biggest gains for students pre and post test. That's one of the 4 monster sort of studies looking at thousands of students in terms of sort of traditional lecture approaches versus active learning. Another great review of the research here from Michael Prince, and Michael Prince he's in engineering, looks across all these studies, all these different examples, and comes up, of course, with that, there is support for core elements of active collaborative learning and problem-based learning everywhere, all over the research. We can pick and choose from multiple studies to see this example. What I really like about Joel Michaels, who's a physiologist who talks about the evidence of active learning, is he talks about the wealth of research supporting the benefits in helping students master difficult subjects. What Joel Michael talks about, which is really interesting, is that if the research on active learning was in, let's say, pharmacology and talking about the effectiveness of a drug, we would have stopped researching this about 10 to 15 years ago. It was clear. We just keep over-researching it over and over and over and over and over, that active learning works and active learning can work. But there are some caveats to that, and we're going to get to that in a second. The most recent one by Scott Freeman and company that came out of some STEM research looking at like hundreds and hundreds, I think it was 250 different studies in a meta-analysis, is looking at, students in traditional lecture courses are 1.5 times more likely to fail compared to students in active learning courses. And students with active learning classes outperform those traditional lectures by at least a standard deviation. So they're at least getting 1 shift higher in grades, so from B's to B+, B+ to A-, etc. So, we can keep going. I mean, we can keep going with evidence. Improved student understanding, improved student retention, improved attitude, problem solving, conceptual learning. Let's keep going. Improved student perceptions and attitudes toward literacy. We've got enthusiasm, increased content knowledge, development of graduate capabilities, critical thinking. I mean, we could go on and on and on all day, all right? But there's buckets of evidence to suggest that this is a great approach to learning. And one of my favorite quotes, which is a great way to reduce all of this research down to one sentence, is the one who does the work does the learning. And that's a critical part of this that we really need to think about. But one of the questions that comes up is, well, does that mean the lecture is dead? So is the lecture dead? Would anybody say, is the lecture dead? No. Okay. Not today. Good point. I take your point. Okay. But the lecture isn't dead. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And one of the chief reasons for it is the secret little nugget of our profession. So our profession in learning sciences, where we study the science of learning, we have a magical little secret piece of knowledge that once you understand, you can basically understand everything you need to know about teaching and learning. And I'll get to that. Because one of the key things that's here is from Michael is that, active learning doesn't happen. And this is one of the most difficult parts about the research on whether active learning is successful, where's the evidence for it, is that you can do active learning badly, right? And you can do lecturing well, and you can do active learning when you're not supposed to do active learning, and you can do lecturing when you're not supposed to do lecturing. So one of these problems is that when you look at the research, is that it's very, very difficult to kind of create a little bottled experiment, which you really determine once and for all that active learning is successful. Why? Because all you can do as an instructor is create the best environment possible for learning to occur. You can never guarantee it. And that's one of the things that's really important when we look at it. So that magical little nugget has to do with when you think of the design of teaching and learning, and this is what we use in terms of our conceptual framework, is we have the content of the course, what do you want to teach? We have the outcomes, what do you want the students to learn? We have the assessment, which is how do you know the students learn what you want them to learn? And last, we have our strategies, which is, well, what activities are you going to use to support learning that's out there? And it's all in a circle because you can start at any point. You can start at the end and do backwards design. You can start at the beginning with outcomes and work your way forward. You could start with content and strategies. You have a clinical bedside teaching scenario. Well, clinical bedside pretty much limits the type of strategies you have. Suddenly it changes your circle. So one of the nice things when you think about this is the nugget, the secret of our entire profession. And I'm going to give it to you, and I'll probably get, taken away in a black van after this by the learning science people. It's all about alignment. And alignment is that magic word. The magic word, the real reason why alignment is important is because if what you want your students to do is to get motivated to learn, and doing, let's say, low-level facts and ideas, just sort of getting started, well, then a lecture is perfectly appropriate. If you want students to focus on deep learning, then you're going to have to do active learning. So it's more about what learning is appropriate where than it is whether you do the learning or whether you do lecturing or whether you do active learning. So it's something to keep in mind as we're moving forward. Because the last part I want to talk to you about, which is, what does space have to do with all of this, and why does space matter? Because, okay, you buy the idea, okay, yeah, active learning is a really good idea. In fact, most faculty do. When you talk to faculty, a lot of faculty don't necessarily like the idea of standing up and talking the entire time. They kind of want to get in with their students and do things with their students. But often when you start talking with them about where they're teaching, you realize that the environment is actually killing a lot of the interest that they have in doing something new. So we have humans in the built environment. This is a sort of a cityscape of Montreal from the top of the mountain. So as you know, and as we mentioned before, we have a built environment that we live in. We have created our environment around us. Everything is built. There is virtually no or very little natural environment. We live within a built environment situation. And there are three ways that space can impact that built environment. The first is space impacts perception. We can create optical illusions very, very easily to make you think that you're about to fall into a hole, just with the design of a space. That alone shows you the power of a visual space and a visual layout, that it looks like these people are floating. That's how powerful space is. Space can trick your brain entirely in terms of perceptions that you have. Here's another great example. It's just a drawing on concrete, but it really looks like this poor person's about to get eaten by a crocodile. Another great example. And another thing that's interesting about perception is, here's a building that looks like you can almost see through it. I mean, what an interesting way of impacting your thinking and your approach and how you interact with space when you see things and the environment is able to shape your thinking in that way. So, great example is the impact of color. So, how many people know who this is? Okay, a few of you know who this is. Now I want to do a trick. How many of you know who it is now? Okay, a few more, actually a number more. The change of eye color for Zooey Deschanel. So Zooey Deschanel is an actress. She's not the most famous, and I have to find an example where it's like, Obama or something like that, but it wouldn't work because they're too famous. But you can see the difference. This is a change in a color of an eye, how different those two pictures look. And that's an example where color can impact, and I can see an interior design person smiling. Color has an impact on how we learn. If you look at the psychology of color, red's an activating color, blue is a quieting color. We can design our environments with color to impact the approaches and the feeling that we have when we enter space. The second thing I want to talk about is that space impacts interaction. And this is about the study of proxemics. And what's really interesting about proxemics is it talks about 4 different types of space. So public space from 12 feet to 25 feet and beyond is really designed around public discussions. That, in other words, that if you're that far away, so I can see people that are in the back row are really in the public space here. I can barely see your eyes. I'm not 100% sure if you're looking at me or if you're staring off into space. It's hard to sort of tell engagement. I can see body language, but only really obvious body language. I can't see a shift in your approach or anything like that. But public space is really that idea of a performance space. So I'm performing in a public space. Social space is a little bit closer. So now I start getting into a situation where I'm between 4 and 12 feet. the feeling that you have is much different. Suddenly I can see your eyes a lot better. I can see whether you're looking at me or other things. I can see if you're focusing or not focusing. I can see from your body language if you're kind of accepting what I'm talking about or want to challenge it. And we can move a little bit farther to sort of a more personal space. When I start getting much closer, suddenly a smile automatically pops up. I can see facial expressions change. I can really feel a lot more about what type of interaction is happening between an individual. An intimate space, well, I'm not going to go into intimate space, but you can use your own imagination what intimate space is. Intimate space has pheromones and a whole bunch of other very, very, very interesting cues that come with intimate space. What's really interesting is that social space is where a lot of the learning happens. When you think about interacting with your students, the reason why you want to sit down at a table is because you want to go from social to personal. When you sit at a table with students and you're really close to them, suddenly you're in a personal space. You can feel a lot more connection with the students that are here. I step back a little bit farther and look at two groups. I'm connected to you, but it's not the same kind of feeling. I've moved from personal to social. What's really difficult when you look at public spaces is most of our lecture halls, students are in the public space. They expect to be lectured at. Why? Because they're so far away. I mean, they're in public, they're expecting a performance, essentially. That's the idea. What we need to do, and why active learning classrooms are interesting, is because we're changing from a majority of public space to a majority of social and personal space. Why is the instructor in the middle of the room as much as possible? Well, because what you're doing is you're putting students connected to faculty, and that's what we have to think about. Of course, space impacts performance. And anybody who's worked in an environment like that knows that performance can be greatly impacted by the type of space that you're in. You know, why we have different types of desks now, why we have balls that people sit on as opposed to this, why we stand up, why we sit down, why we have collaborative spaces. And if you look at the work environment, we're very accepting that we have different environments for different tasks. So if I want to talk with each other, I go to a place that I can talk with each other. If I want to, let's say, do something on my own, I have a place to do something on my own. But we haven't done a lot of that transition, except for our two universities, of course, haven't done a lot of that transition into doing that with universities. We don't, I mean, when we book a room, we book the same room for the entire semester. We still haven't been able to crack that nut very well. We're struggling with that too. That means I have to use one room forever. Oh, okay, so that means that at least the room has to be flexible because I got to be able to change it around. But what happens when I'm not in a flexible room? Oh, another barrier. So it's like barrier upon barrier upon barrier that we put in front of people in terms of learning. Here's another great example, you know, that of impacting performance. You know, great way to be put down into the basement. If you've ever taught in a basement classroom that's windowless and has very little air, you know that you have a really hard time making that class work. I can see some nods of people who've been stuck in a basement classroom somewhere with horrible furniture. Now, I want to tell you a little bit story and a little bit of an example of what this means. And we all know Winston Churchill. And you may not know that this quote is attributed to him, that we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us. Well, what's the story behind that? The story behind that is basically when the Germans blew up basically London, one of the things they destroyed was the House of Commons. And when Churchill was tasked with rebuilding the House of Commons, he thought, okay, there's some things that I don't like about the way we interact in Parliament. So I'm going to redesign the space to actually elicit a certain type of behavior. The first thing that Winston Churchill did is that he designed the space with less seats than people, which is really odd. And the second thing is that he designed it so that there were clearly two sides. You had to sit on this side or you sit on this side. There was no middle. And if you wanted to go from this side to this side, you had to walk across the middle of the floor. Why did he do this? What was the reasoning behind? The reason why he had less seats than people is, one, he wanted to make sure that, you know, 75% of the people are only going to come anyways. He wanted to make it appear full, right? That was one thing. The second thing is that he realized is that, okay, what I really want is people to be uncomfortable because I want there to be a sense of urgency. I don't want people to sit back, lay back, and debate all afternoon. I want them to be uncomfortable, standing, leaning over their friends and saying, okay, make a decision, vote, let's go on, let's move on, let's move on. He wanted people to move. And that's why he made less seats than people. He also had the two sides because he said if you cross the floor, he wanted you with the notion, so okay, you're going to vote against the party and cross the floor, you have to get up and cross the floor. And everybody sees you cross the floor, and you have to be willing to take that on when you cross the floor. So it's a great example of how you can build an environment and shape behavior. And that's a wonderful story that you can take in terms of your thinking about why active learning classrooms work and et cetera. So what is this message of this classroom? And of course you don't have any classrooms like this. This is an example of one of our McGill classrooms that we had yet to renovate. What does this message communicate about learning? What would you say?
Stop
Static. What else? Docile. What else? One way. What does it tell students? Sit down and be quiet, right? I mean, it gives the instructor the position of, I am going to tell you everything you need to know. And you write notes, and we reinforce that fire hose model of learning. You know the fire hose model where I, as an instructor, will open the fire hose, coat all of you down, you all have buckets, you catch as much water as possible, then I wander around with a ruler, and whoever has the most water in the bucket gets the highest grade. Voila, fire hose model of learning. What's really important about space is that we have to think about is that space creates expectations of behavior, it suggests how to act, and communicates what's valued. When all of our spaces look like that, it is a value that we're placing on learning. And one of the great quotes that comes from Peter Jameson is that our physical spaces on campus, our built environment on campus, is a physical manifestation of the teaching and learning vision for the university. And that's something we have to think about. Because we took this idea and said, okay, well, how can we make this real? What can we do to make this work in terms of connecting space to research? So what we did is we took something called Nessie. Not that you know anything about Nessie. Which, of course, I only connected the dots about with Tracy. Is like, oh yeah, that's right, you guys built Nessie. I forgot about that. But we took Nessie as our principles in terms of effective teaching and learning, and we mapped everything we're doing in space to it so that we can talk to our administrators with language that they were interested in. We wanted learning spaces rolling up to academic challenge that will be varied for both individual and collaborative work. If we give students this much space to work, how could they possibly use their laptop? How could they have different materials? How could they engage with the content in the course if they don't even have enough room to work? Learning with peers, we should be able to have environments that allow people to interact with content and with each other. So we have people facing each other as opposed to facing one direction. Experiences with faculty, we want to be able to reduce barriers. We want podiums in the middle of the room to reduce the barriers instead of on the sides. And we want a campus environment that's going to support different types of learning, that's going to have the ability to have future flexibility and things along that. And high impact practices, we want to make sure that we're able to do those in our physical spaces if possible. And there's a lot more to that. But what that ended up is we thought, after doing some of our designs in our buildings in the first few years, maybe about 10 years ago, is, well, how would we, if we ripped a room apart to nothing, design a room for collaboration? And that's where active learning classrooms came from. And these came from not just us, but a lot of people at the time, about 6, 7 years ago, that were building them. But for our approach, which is exactly what matches yours, is that we see active learning classrooms or active learning spaces as a range of classrooms with combinations of features to do different types of learning, so that you can match what you're doing with the type of space. Space is supposed to support your teaching and learning, not direct it. So in other words, you want to do a certain type of teaching and suddenly you can't do it in this space, you need to be in a space that can do that. So we want spaces that were designed to promote active and collaborative learning, that increased interaction, that had enriched educational experiences with technology and supported students. So good examples of this, MIT had their Teal classroom back in 2000 when they did this. Interesting story, when they first built the room, they never provided much support at the very beginning, and the entire physics curriculum nearly crippled itself because nobody wanted to teach in there, they had no buy-in. So nobody really hears a lot about those behind-the-scenes stories of the successes, but years later, they've had great success. Brunix Hall, University of Minnesota, the largest installation of active learning classrooms in the world, according to them, and as an example. Not that I get along with them very well. I'm not trying to poke at them. But you know, the Claude Moore Education Building as an example. There are hundreds of examples of these. This is for the medical school at the University of Virginia, 168 seats. You notice that they all have themes: round tables, students working together, you know, different teaching positions, et cetera. This is our first active learning classroom in 2009, 72 seats. We had colored tables paired with writable walls. The green table wrote on the green glass, the blue table wrote on the blue glass. Multiple sources, students working together, collaborating either on whiteboards with on the walls or with each other digitally. A lot of what you can do in all of your classrooms as well. We have other active learning classrooms that are more like modeling labs. So these are computer labs, but active computer labs. Students are facing each other. Monitors can go down. You can make eye contact. The tables are shaped like banana boats, so it's easy to share with the person next to you. Things like that. And you'll notice the pillars. We have free pillars. We can give you one if you want. We have lots of classrooms with them. It'd be great. We'd love to give some of them away. Small rooms, 24-seat rooms, where, as you notice, as our time goes on, technology starts to sort of fade away into the background. You don't see as many wires anymore. Your student building 15 with 96 seats, the Collaborative Learning Studio, another great example. Students working together with the ability to share content across the room. The Cedar Hall, 56 seats that you have with your Learn Lab, same idea. And the Collaboration Cafe, another wonderful example of different types of seating to do different types of activities within a classroom. We have a CyberMed facility that we use with our health sciences, and this is for our medical curriculum. We have 3 80-seat active learning classrooms side by side. We could actually spill over, so we could actually have all 240 seats being used at once, where we have interactive activities going between them. That's an example. It's a curved building. It's a little bit unusual. But again, what you're seeing here is that theme coming back. Round tables, writable walls, students working with each other. That's spilled over into the design of our lab facilities. These are examples of organic chemistry and physics labs, dry labs, I should say. There's no gas or anything. But these are Y tables where each team has a glass, graph paper, whiteboard, and projector for each team to work. And of course, when the orange table projects as a little orange light, and when it projects to the rest of the room, all the lights change in the room to say, oh, the orange table is projecting now. The effective use of color to help support pedagogical activity. That's what we're talking about, and that's what you guys have as well. Here's that example. Again, some pillars for free that come with the table. And it's also spilled into our wet labs. These are undergraduate chemistry labs where students are facing each other in pods. So what we have here are 3 pods where we've got 14 to 24 students working on chemistry labs, and we've got the ability for TAs to interact with them without long aisles, without all of that old design that's here. Again, all of this is riffing off the same idea of that active learning classroom that we started with. There's another physics lab that looks at, these are X tables, same idea, counter height, wrappable boards. We have beams for being able to do experiments off them. So we have active learning wet labs at the same time as we have active learning classrooms. That idea of active learning spaces is infiltrated everywhere. And it's infiltrated to a point where we now have, this is a lecture hall that is an active learning lecture hall where we have, instead of rows on tiers, tables on tiers. Students can work in a table of 6 and then have a whiteboard directly behind them. This is a view from the top. Here's the actual room as an example. So we have tables, we have whiteboards, there's going to be portable whiteboards, writing on the walls. Again, it's that idea of bringing what we know works in collaborative spaces everywhere. And of course, what my favorite is what we want to be our basic classroom. Movable furniture, basic AV, writable walls everywhere. That's what we want everywhere. Because it gives us as faculty the most flexibility we can in order to shift our space around in order to support the types of learning that we want to do. What is the evidence of impact? The careful thing we have to worry about with the evidence of impact is that we need to be able to use active spaces as we intended. So in other words, if you use an active learning classroom and you lecture in it, it's going to suck. Now, I mean, you could do a little bit of a lecture, a little bit, but if you talk for 3 hours in an active learning classroom, not only will you not like it, because you're sort of like doing this all the time, but your students are going to be like, I'm at a table and all you're doing is lecturing at me. Something's up. This is weird. It feels strange. But you can overcome it. I mean, you can lecture in an active learning classroom. It's possible. Just like you can do collaborative work in a lecture hall. It's possible. You can overcome that space, get people work together. It's hard to do kind of group work, but it's possible. But there's lots of evidence of impact. I mean, students are constantly reporting higher positive experiences. The outcomes, people are outperforming in these rooms as opposed to regular classrooms. There's decreased failure rates, and that instructors are doing less lecturing and more interacting with students. But we do have to be careful with this, because one of the things that we have to think about is we have to make sure we match the type of activity for the type of space. And that's something to keep in mind as you're looking at all this evidence, is that, yeah, that evidence exists, but it doesn't guarantee that the spaces are going to work unless we support them. We did lots of interviews and focus groups. We did videos. One of the things I want to mention here briefly is that we had such strong evidence from our students, and this is like thousands of students surveyed. We had such strong evidence that the graph, if those of you are in statistics, there was such a skew around the 4 out of 5. The standard deviation was less than 1, around 4. We actually couldn't do much statistics on it. It was so strong that it was difficult to do anything other than, okay, everybody likes it. Like, I mean, it's positive on learning, positive on liking the classroom for the course, facilitating constructive interaction, et cetera. Same for instructors as well. So one of the things that's interesting about the students is that, you know, they really commented on the open space for design. They commented on very interactive, the value for this course, especially that first one. The value I only understood when I got to the exam, because I was practicing. And there's a great story, an example where in a particular class that was in law in this room, or in one of the rooms we were looking at, they do an exam review right before the exam, and it's usually a horrible class. It's a class where there's a lot of tension, everybody's kind of angry, they're practicing for the exam, there's a real big tension there. And what happened when they were doing this 1 year that they were in the active learning classroom, and they've been in there ever since, is the tension was gone. It was there for the first 2 or 3 minutes, and then the students realized, wait a minute, we've been doing this every class. We've been practicing this the whole semester, and it was whoosh. The instructor could feel this sudden lift of, oh, this is not going to be a problem. The exam will be fine, and it was. But it was interesting that feeling was able to be pulled out of that. What I really love is this last quote I just want to poke on here, is the space does not make us learn better, but rather the teaching methods of the teacher that makes a difference. And that's an important part as well. And the last thing I want to leave with you is that we looked at a lot more in depth about how instructors make meaning of these classrooms. And we looked at the approach that the instructor took and then what happened to the rest of the class. And what's really interesting is that we looked at instructor thinking, planning, and action, their actions in the classroom when we observed these classrooms, and then the student learning experience. And what was really interesting is that the more information delivery or the less learning sort of focused instructors were, the more they employed lecturing, they moved around the room a lot less, they spent a lot more time tethered to the podium, and the students correspondingly took a surface approach to learning, and they reported less positive experiences. And of course, it's also prevalent the other way around. The instructors that were more learning focused, that did more activities in the classroom, got better results from their students and better feedback in terms of the learning. Now, a lot of that makes sense, but it means at the end of the day that active learning classrooms make a difference when you have instructors that can take advantage of them, period. That is it. We need to make sure we have the right people with the right skills in the right spaces, and that is, I think, what the Mosaic Initiative is intending to do, and that's exactly what you want to have happen. So the last thing I want to leave you with is a wonderful little thought, is that good teaching can withstand poor spaces, and bad teaching can also withstand good spaces. So it's not an if you build it, they will come. If you build it, the people that actually are attracted will come, that want to teach in that environment will come. But we really have to think about how we make that match. And ultimately, what we want to do is we want to design well-aligned instruction that takes advantages of the affordances that these new spaces provide. And I think with the Mosaic Initiative that you have in place, you guys are really on a track to becoming, the leaders. And actually, I don't know really of any other faculty development program that I have seen across the US that is really looking at this as a real comprehensive support approach that we've been doing as well, and I think it is a phenomenal thing to move forward with. And I think it's great that you're embarking on this process, and I'm sure you will be successful. So I want to leave it there and take a deep breath as you rode along a wild ride of active learning and active learning spaces. And I think at this point to open it up to questions. Perfect. In terms of questions that you guys might have, and feel free to ask the tough ones if you'd like, and I can clarify anything I've talked about this morning. But I do thank you for letting me speak this morning, and I thank Stacy and Dennis and Julie and Tracy and all of the others that have been behind the scenes making sure that this works. So thank you. Questions? No questions at all? None?
Well, so
You got burning questions in front of you.
Well, so what about our good David Payton? What about our first question?
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
The first question was, how do we get faculty that don't want to teach collaboratively to teach collaboratively? That's sort of the gist of the question. Does that make sense? The problem is that you can't. What you're looking at, and if you look at all the research in terms of shifting practice to collaborative rather than information delivery, it really requires a change in philosophy. And the change in philosophy is not something that changes overnight, and it takes a very long time, and some people never get there. It's actually talked about in literature as something called a threshold concept. And a threshold concept is one of those ideas that when you pass through the door, there is no going back. And learning about active learning and about how students really learn, once you start getting the bug around that idea, you can't go backwards. It's impossible not to have active classes because you start realizing that, wait a minute, if I just stand up here for an hour and a half, they're really not listening to me. I mean, it might look like they're listening to me, but they really aren't. And once you start being able to release the idea, and the best thing I've ever heard about when it comes to talking about, well, how am I going to cover the content, right? Oh my God, I've got so much content to cover. The first question that I usually ask is, well, what do you mean cover the content? Does that mean you just have to talk about it? So if you talk about it, does that mean everything worked? Like you're good, everybody learned everything? You said the content, so therefore everything's fine, right? So do you just have to speak it? What do you mean by cover the content? That's one question. The second thing that we usually talk about when it comes to the covering the content question is that just because you're doing an activity doesn't mean you're not covering the content. So what you have to shift thinking about is that, well, covering the content could be me telling you the content, but it'd be a lot more powerful if you discovered that content through an activity that I designed. So when I extract the content from the course, I'm not really extracting the content. All I'm doing is changing the strategy. The content is still there, the outcomes are still there. I've just swapped one strategy and put in a better one. That's all. And so that's some of the discussions that you can have around content, around philosophy, and how do you deal with faculty that really don't want to shift. That being said, if they don't want to shift, you're going to have an awful hard time working in that situation. What I would do, and I think what you guys have done, and what the best way to do is you work with the people that want to be there and want to get engaged. The best thing with faculty that don't want to change at all is ask them to do one thing. And one thing, it's very simple. In any lecture class, when you ask a question, don't pick on somebody for a response. Ask the question and say, turn to your neighbor, talk for 30 seconds, and then get a response. That one small change goes from one person being engaged with the response to everybody in the room has said something. So it's a simple change, one little strategy change, bam, you've got everybody engaged. And once instructors start to get that bug of the students are actually talking to each other, then everybody feels more free, and then it starts to domino. It's sort of like once the house of cards starts to fall, it all comes crashing down pretty soon. So that's how I would respond to that question. Yes?
Have you seen any evidence that?
Oh.
Have you seen any evidence that instructors who are resistant to active learning walking into one of these classrooms and seeing an active learning lesson plan in their discipline makes a difference in how they engage with this kind of practice?
You're looking at do people change practice as a result of being in a classroom like this?
Or seeing it?
Yeah, I mean, seeing it, it's hard to see it. I mean, because what ends up happening is you get a lot of excuses. Well, this isn't my discipline. It's not the same as what I do. I do things differently. This wouldn't work for me. When people try a class and they're in an active learning classroom and they do, let's say, a lecture or something along those lines, there is that opportunity, and one of two things happens. Either they say, this room is not for me, and they go off back to wherever they were before and they're going to continue to practice that way. Or they suddenly see, this is kind of interesting. You know, maybe I need to talk to somebody a little bit about, I could see something could be different here, but I'm not sure what to do. So I think that's where the instructional design sort of folks, people in teaching and learning, you focus on that fork and try to make sure that the people that have that experience, that they didn't necessarily pick to be in an active learning classroom, but they're there, have a good one and not a bad one. But that being said, I think the approach that you guys have, which is the same one we've had, is you get the people that want to be there in the space. And we have always said, well, if you don't want to be in the space, get out. We got like 15 people behind you that want to be in here. So if you want to be in here, you can be in here. If you don't, you don't. And so we've sort of done it in that way. And there are always going to be, we sort of have these kind of three groups of instructors. We've got the instructors that have always taught collaboratively. And when they go into spaces like this, it was like, oh my God, this was built for me. This is like my room. I love it. This is the best place ever, right? That's the group up here. You got the group at the other end that it's like, they just want to lecture. They're not really that interested in teaching. They will hate this room. And they pretty much don't really want to be in any room, to be that matter, but they're really not going to change. They would prefer to be in their lab. This is really not for them, right? So that's that. The middle group is often the biggest group, and that's usually people that buy into the idea. Like, okay, I get the idea of being active with my students, but I don't know what to do. Like, what do I do Monday? Like, how do I do this activity Tuesday? That's where it's really good to talk to your faculty developers, because they are the ones who are going to give you, I got a great idea for you. We want to try this. Or here's a book on active learning with 1 million strategies. And some of that we can talk about this afternoon, actually, with our activities. More questions. Go for it.
Yeah, so,
Wait, we've got a mic to capture that.
yeah, so we have
Yeah.
a classroom database, and instructors can select different features of classrooms that they want, such as the size, the number of students that can fit in the classroom, whether there's a document camera and all these other sorts of things. But I've wondered for a while whether we might benefit from having some sort of a tag that for active learning, indicating that a classroom is particularly suitable to active learning. But I don't want it to be so restrictive that there are only 5, classrooms on campus that count for active learning. So one issue is you might think that just if it's a small classroom that would be sufficient to make it conducive to active learning. But one problem is that some of these small classrooms, even though they're small, the desks are so crammed together that you can't really organize them into groups of 4. So I guess I'm just wondering if there were to be a tag for classrooms at IU, that suggests that they're conducive to group learning or active learning or whatever. Do you have any thoughts about what the criteria might be to fit to get such a tag?
Do you want to tackle that question?
So we're actually going to do that, because one of the things that we did was to think about what does it mean to be an active learning classroom at all. And some of them are going to be very high-end, like the ones that Adam showed, and some of them are going to be more modest. So what does it mean to be an active learning enabled classroom? And Adam hit on a lot of the things that we have come up with as well, that it has to be an opportunity for students to move around, to work together, and to have the ability to share what they do. That could be low tech, that could be markers on whiteboards, which is doable even in a building like Ballantyne Hall. So we're going to figure out a way to tag our classrooms to say these are active enabled classrooms. And I think that that's a huge step forward. And this was a non-trivial task, actually, to define what do we actually mean by this. And if we're going to think mosaic, we have to think about the mosaic of different kinds of classrooms and which ones would we call an active learning enabled classroom and which ones would we not. When we're crammed so tightly together, even if those tablet armchairs moved, it's disingenuous for us to say that's active learning because they literally cannot move. So we're working with our registrar friends who, of course, always have the tension that lots of seats need to be in rooms to accommodate the need for the capacity. But we're getting there, and we have strong advocates like Michelle Buckland in Interiors who, furniture manufacturers are getting better too. There's ways to make furniture more efficient, and I hadn't seen some of the things that they're doing at McGill, and that affords us some opportunities too. So I think it's a long answer, but that we're going to do that at IU, and I think that this will be important. Then you can say, I want that one, because that one will let me do what I want to do in terms of active learning. So Tracy tells me that we are out of time. I wanted to do a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank the communications office in UITS, who has been doing things like taking pictures, making sure microphones work, making sure Adam's slides look great, and generally taking care of all the technology for this event. They're an amazing team, and they did a terrific job. I also want to acknowledge the communications office people who created all of the beautiful graphics around the Mosaic Initiative. They handmade the centerpieces on the table and all of that. So this is amazing, and they have worked tirelessly to get ready for this event. And then I don't think we've officially introduced Tracy Birdwell, although she's been, we've referenced her a few times. We hired her into the role of the Mosaic Principal Consultant 2 months ago, and she's accomplished about 6 months worth of work in about 2 months, and she will be the face of the Mosaic Initiative. So as it rolls out to the other campuses, Tracy will become one of the most popular people at Indiana University. So many, many thanks to her for all that she's done for this event. And finally, thanks to Adam for a terrific talk.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Thanks for coming.